progress we've been made even during lockdown. There is a really exciting announcement coming which relates to a partnership that has been signed, but I won't spoil that. We'll put that in the magazine, and then hopefully you'll see the real powerful engagement that will bring. Absolutely delighted with that partnership, and delighted on the other professional body who's engaged with us. So more on that in the magazine. Also, we've got the Stella group up and running. This is the young persons group. We've kind of said 18 to 30, just to give a benchmark, but it doesn't preclude people who are slightly over that. We've had a couple of meetings. People are really engaged. We're looking now for mentors, so if I could put that call out for people. We're looking for mentors for young people. We're looking for speakers like we've got today as well, and we're looking for placement job opportunities, networking, social media activities, and already the group have set up a WhatsApp group and all of those things. So under the stewardship of Suzanne and myself, the group are up and running. Exciting times ahead there. There'll be a little bit of social interaction post-COVID lockdown as well, which will be really nice. But delighted that that piece of work has come together. So yeah, lots going on with QSI. Please keep in touch with Suzanne. Please get social media interacting as well. It'd be great to see more of you on LinkedIn and engaging on Twitter and other social media platforms. But let's welcome our speaker, Andy Hewitt, today from Claims Class. Andy is a QSI fellow member. Constantly writes in the magazine, so that's where you've heard and seen Andy's sort of name before. And today Andy's kindly presenting on construction claims and responses, effective writing and presentation. It is a CPD event. E-certificates will be available, and we'll ask the speaker at the close whether slides could be available as well. But thank you for joining us. I'm going to blend into the background now and hand over to Andy, and we look forward to your presentation. Thank you, Andy.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thanks very much, Paul. As Paul mentioned, I've been a fellow of the QSI for a long time, and to be honest, I must apologise, not terribly active, apart from helping Suzanne out with the odd article for the magazine. But it is something that I'm very, very passionate about, and I think people with grey hair, no hair, and a lot of knowledge do have a professional duty to pass some of that knowledge on and help younger people in their career. So this is my first CPD event for the QSI, and thank you very much for inviting me. Unfortunately, we have some technical issues, so Suzanne's going to be operating the presentation slides, and I'm going to be talking about it. So if it gets a little bit clunky, blame me, because I'm old and IT challenged. So if we can go to the presentation, Suzanne, please.
Oh, I can.
There we go. Can we go to full screen, or is that how it's going to be?
I think that's it, Andy. I can't see anything.
That's absolutely no problem. I just need to get rid of a Teams bar at the bottom, which doesn't seem to want to happen. Told you there we go. Right, so the topic of the talk is basically construction claims, which I guess many people from a QS type background will inevitably get involved in at some point or another. Before I go on with the claim, just to give you a little bit of background about myself, I'm a partner in the Hewitt Decipher Partnership, and we provide various services internationally on claims, contractual advice, contract admin, dispute management, commercial issues, lots of programming and delay analysis type of thing, and expert witnesses. So that is how I spend part of my professional life. And the other part is Suzanne, if you don't mind, is Claims Class, which is a training and education company which we set up back in 2012 to provide education and training centered around my own specialist subjects, which are generally claims and the FIDIC forms of contract. So we have various ways which people can learn with us. We have e-courses, so people can go through the course in their own time. We can bring our courses to companies, and the latest thing, which is not on the slide, excuse me, is what we call live online, where we do a series of training courses for about 1.5 hours per week for 6 or 7 weeks. People join us pretty much like this, and we will go through a course over a 7-week period. Talked about the topics, and that's the end of the commercial break. So let's get on with. Oh, sorry, there's another commercial break coming up. There may be a couple of books that you're interested in there. The one really which, if you've signed in to this webinar wanting to know more about claims, it is the first one on the left, and our courses are based around the book, but feedback from the book since it was published in 2011, it's now in its 2nd edition, has been excellent. So if you are getting involved in claims, I'm not trying to sell you a book here, but I'd just like to point out that many people have found it very, very useful, and it's unlocked a lot of mysteries about claims, which is exactly what I wanted to happen. Okay, Suzanne, now onto the course. So really, first of all, let's start. What actually is a claim? Well, it's very, very simple. A lot of lawyers, a lot of consultants like ourselves build this up into being a big mystique. It's a black art. It's something that only specialists and themselves can deal with and charge you a lot of money. But at the end of the day, it's quite simple. It's just asking for something to which you're entitled under the contract or occasionally at law. So if an instruction's been issued and can we go back a bit, Suzanne?
Sorry.
I'll let you know.
Okay.
So for example, if you're working as a QS on a project and I will refer, by the way, to the engineer rather than the architect or the contracts administrator. The engineer gives you some revised drawings, but doesn't actually acknowledge that this is a variation for which you can claim you can have some additional money. It may be necessary to ask for that additional money for the additional or changed work. So that is in fact a claim. It's a fairly simple one, but then we can have claims that are associated to delays that have been caused and disruption that's been caused due to a global pandemic, which is not going to be so easy. So everything in between now, we're just asking for something to which we feel we're entitled to. Okay, Suzanne? So once we're in a position and we realise that the contract gives us entitlement to make a claim, or we need to ask for something like that payment for that variation, why is it necessary to produce a fully detailed and professionally presented claim or response? Well, if you don't ask for things in the right way, you're putting the person who is responsible for making the award in a very, very difficult position. Think about the engineer, and possibly some of you are working on the consultant's employer side of the fence. He's responsible for making time awards and monetary awards to the person who's paying his fees, the employer. And if he's not certain of, firstly, the entitlement of the contractor to have that award made, or the amount of the award that is being claimed, he's going to be very, very reluctant and possibly professionally prohibited from making that award. And sometimes they won't sort of say, well, I don't understand the claim, or I don't agree with the claim because there are bits missing out of it. They'll just reject your claim. So I guess many of you are parents, So think about it. If one of your kids comes to you and says, I want a new bike because I want a new bike and it's my birthday, what's the reaction going to be? If, on the other hand, if your child comes along and says, Mummy, Daddy, my old bike's really broken and I've grown out of it now. And if I had a nice new bike, it would make my life much, much happier. And I'd be more inclined to put my toys away in the evening before I go to bed. OK, which kid are you going to give the new bike to? So it's a little bit like that. Thanks, Suzanne. So we've decided, or I'm recommending, that we actually produce a professionally produced claim. So what should that look like? Well, what I call the essential elements of a successful claim come down to 4 things. And my old boss, Roger Knowles, taught me this many, many years ago, before he even became my boss: cause, effect, entitlement, and substantiation. So if you take just a few things away from this webinar, if one of the things that you take away is C's, and you remember this when you are preparing a claim, or in fact responding to a claim, that will be a great thing, and I'll be very, very happy that you've remembered it. So let's have a look at what these are. Firstly, the cause. Quite simple. It's what happened on the project. And we can usually demonstrate the cause in the claim from the project records. So we can say on the 1st of January, the engineer issued an instruction which instructed us to incorporate these a certain amount of revised drawings into the project. That's pretty easy. The cause was the issue of the instruction. Maybe then we need to have to go on to say this change in the nature of the project involved us in more work or different work, and the effect, which we'll come on to, was that we need some more money for it. So we can usually establish the cause from the project records, providing that your contract administration is good enough and you've got the project records. If we're talking about a claim for an extension of time, well, possibly it could be a build-up to things that is leading to a delay. So again, the cause could be a large part of the claim, but basically we're just in this section of the claim telling factually what happened on the project. So once we've established that, we need to move on to the effect. So now we talk about the effect on the project. It's fairly simple stuff: cause, effect. And I guess many of you know about the importance of linking cause with effect in claims. Well, this is what we're doing here. So we then have to explain what effect the event that we've established by the cause had on the project in terms of, firstly, time, because it could well be that a delay that occurred actually delayed some activities, but it didn't have an effect on the time for completion. If it did have an effect on the time for completion, we need to demonstrate that effect, generally by producing a delay analysis. So here's another group of activities that we're including in our program for the variation. We had to get additional materials approved, we had to procure the materials, they had to be delivered, and then we had to incorporate the changes into the work. So that becomes a little fragnet to insert into our program to produce a delay analysis to prove what effect the delay event had on the time for completion. And of course, then we've got money, because always with extensions of time, we have incurred additional cost through having to keep our site establishment, our contractual obligations such as insurances and bonds and guarantees live, and pay for these things for an extra period. So we're talking about prolongation costs here. We could be talking about disruption costs, where we can no longer work as efficiently as we should have been able to work. Or we could talk about straightforward variation costs. Instead of having 1,000 cubic meters of concrete, we've now got 1,100 cubic meters of concrete. So that's, you know, just a quantity surveying exercise. Thanks, Suzanne.
Oh, it won't go.
Well, okay.
There we go.
We thought you'd gone for a cup of tea then, and I was going to ask for mine with no sugar, please.
I was pressing buttons and nothing was happening.
So the third thing from C's is entitlement. So it's not just a case of something happened on the project for which we want some money on some additional time. There has to be entitlement included within the contract, or sometimes under the law, for us to seek compensation for the event. So the tower crane broke down for a month and that delayed us. Is that something that you can claim for? Be very, very doubtful. So that's a claimable event. COVID happened and that delayed and disrupted our project. Is that something we can claim for? Well, this is where we have to go to the actual contract to find out whether mass epidemics constitute something like force majeure, and whether the contract allows us to claim for time, or time and money, or just one or the other. So we've got to demonstrate the entitlement within our claim. And generally there will be a discussion about clause whatever says this, and that entitles us to payment for the varied works, or to prolongation costs because of the delay, or to an extension of time because of the delay that was caused by X, Y, or Z. So cause, effect, and entitlement. And the last one in C's is substantiation. And just like a lawyer going to court to make a case, to either prosecute or defend a person, he goes to court with evidence. He doesn't just say, this person's guilty because we know that he didn't like the bloke very much and he was in the vicinity when the guy was stabbed to death. That's not going to get a conviction, is it? But if the lawyer goes to court with, here's some CCTV footage showing the defendant stabbing the guy, and here's a pathologist report to say that the guy died from stab wounds, and here's another report to say that the defendant's fingerprints were all over the knife that was found later. This is building up the case. So what we have to do in our claim is, just like the lawyer, we have to go to the person reviewing the claim and we have to substantiate every statement that we rely on or every fact that we put forward within the claim, so that whoever, and again I ask you to put yourself into the position of the person receiving the claim and having to make an award, and help them to say yes to your claim. So this happened on the site, and here is a copy of a letter to prove that this happened. The engineer issued revised drawings, and here's a copy of the drawing issue note. Or the materials that were subject of the revision arrived on site at this date, which allowed us to start the installation. And here's a copy of the delivery note. Or for prolongation costs, during the time of the delay, we had a project manager, a quantity surveyor, a planner, 3 engineers, a T-boy, some officers, a T-room, a safety officer, 3 transit vans, and a forklift on the site. These are time-related costs. We then had to employ and pay for all these resources for an additional period. And here is our weekly, daily, monthly report from the month that the delay occurred to demonstrate and to substantiate that these resources were actually on site and allocated to the project. So we have to prove what we're saying is correct to make the person reviewing the claim their job easy. Thanks, Suzanne. Oh, And I've sort of talked about whether the substantiation will be there. But again, it all depends on you having good contracts administration, the right records and access to the records when you're compiling the claim. So we've now got to a situation, something's happened on the site. We know what we're going to write about, C's, and the next thing is we're staring at a blank computer screen and we need to put our claim together. So I've come up with 4 key points which will make a claim effective, or in fact, if you're responding to a claim on behalf of the engineer, to make that response effective. So firstly, key point number 1, make the reviewer's job as easy and pleasant as possible. And we'll talk about how we can do this. But if you don't explain in your claim what happened very easily, or if you don't include backup information, or that backup information is difficult to understand, you are not going to elicit much sympathy for your claim. And any of you who have sat down and had to review a contractor's claim or a subcontractor's claim that has not been put together very, very well, you will realize that that just really antagonizes you, and you feel less and less like making an award and more about rejecting the claim, because really they haven't done a very good job and it's hard for you to understand. So that's key point number 1, make the reviewer's job as easy and pleasant as possible. Key point number 2, ensure that the submission is a standalone document. And the goal that you are trying to reach here is that whatever you give the engineer to review in terms of your claim, you should not be making him open his computer, go to the document control room, or look for anything. You should be presenting that and submitting that with your claim. There is a caveat on that. I'll come to that on key point number 4. So let's move on to number 3. Third point, assume that the reviewer has no prior knowledge of the project. It's very, very easy to assume that you are writing the claim for a guy in the next site cabin that you have a cup of tea with a couple of times a week to read. And that person knows what's been happening on the project. He knows the circumstances of the claim. And you assume that because he knows, and I say here, my apologies, he or she knows, that you can skip things. Well, that's very, very dangerous, because whilst certain times your opposite number with the engineer may be the person responsible, what if that person doesn't have the time to deal with the claims? What if he doesn't have the expertise and the experience and it's elevated to head office? What if they bring in a specialist consultant to review the claim? What if it ends up being a dispute and it has to be submitted to a dispute adjudication board or an adjudicator? So those people that I've just mentioned need to be able to understand the claim absolutely from A to B, not to B, to Z, and everything in between. So it's very, very dangerous to assume that the person reading the claim knows what you know, or to assume that they know what's going on. So it needs to be a complete standalone document so that a reviewer with no prior knowledge can understand it. And you'll find that once you put your first claim together on a project, a lot of the information that you include in that claim, you can just cut and paste into every subsequent claim. So it's very worthwhile putting extra effort into the first claim that you produce on the project, because it can be used time and time again. So moving on, key point number 4. Again, I told you earlier that we provide training and education, and one of the things I noticed from our students who are put in a position where they have to answer assignments and produce sections of claims is that, and also from reviewing many claims professionally, It is true to say that many people think that quantity is a substitute for quality. It isn't. Quantity will confuse the person reading it. Quantity will bore the person reading it out of their pants, so they're not going to feel very sympathetic towards you. So it's very important that you develop the art of saying, well, firstly, identifying what needs to be said in your claim, and secondly, then making that point and saying it as clearly and concisely as possible. Just because something happened on the project doesn't mean to say that you need to write about it if it doesn't add value to your claim and doesn't make a definite point that needs to be made. So, again, looking at lawyers and claims consultants who seem to think that sometimes they're paid by the word or by the paragraph, and produce transit van loads of paperwork to back up a claim up, that's not necessarily, in fact, it is seldom the right way to do it. So try to keep it as concise and obviously well explained as possible. Right, thanks, Suzanne. So how do we achieve these key points? Well, firstly, we need to, sorry, could we go back, Suzanne, please?
I wasn't sure if there was more underneath.
Firstly, we are professionals. We're quantity surveyors. We are whatever profession we come back from. And our company is a professional company. So we need to just put the document together so that it's well presented. It's a little bit like going to an interview, and you will take the time to put your best suit on and wear a tie and polish your shoes, because you want to produce the impression to the people interviewing you that you know what you're talking about, you're a professional person, and you should be hired for the job. So professional presentation always. Thanks, Suzanne. Ensure that the document is user-friendly. Sometimes claims will be quite substantial documents. I mean, typically we might be looking at 100 pages of narrative for the first part, and maybe a large box file for all the backup information, the delay analysis programs, the substantiating document. So we need to make sure that the reader, whose job, remember key point number one, we may need to make as easy and pleasant as possible, can find documents by including cross-references to supporting documents within the narrative, and then making sure there are tab dividers, or if we're working electronically, links, hyperlinks to the relevant documents, so that that person sat down reviewing the claim can find everything that they need to do to be able to go through the claim narrative and say, I've checked that, that's correct, that's been verified, happy with that, and you're helping them to do that easily. Many times, I'll have a list of 50 exhibits in a accompanying box file, but they're not in any particular order, or they're not cross-referenced back to the narrative. This is just annoying for the reviewer. So what are we saying on let's go back to the slides. Ensure the submission document is well ordered and indexed to enable a reviewer to quickly find documents, and present reference material and documents in a separate volume to the narrative. So what I like to do is allow the reader to be reading the claim in one document, and we're going back to the days when everything was hard copies, and have another file open so we can turn to the engineer's instruction and verify that what we said in the narrative is correct, or he can turn to the delay analysis programs and he can verify that we've done what we said we did in the narrative, and he needs to be able to quickly and easily find those documents. Thanks, Suzanne. We need to ensure that the narrative is easily read and properly understood, and we need to bear in mind that in these days of international projects, not everybody's language, or first language, is possibly going to be in the language that we write the claim in. Not everybody has got contractual expertise, so they know what contractual words and phrases mean. So my advice, and again, it's something that's not particularly complied with by lawyers and claims consultants, is to keep the writing style simple and direct. So decide what you're going to say and say it in the easiest way that you can. One of my pet hates is reading a narrative or a letter, or in fact anything which is full of acronyms and abbreviations. Because remember, we're writing our claim for somebody that's got no prior knowledge of the project. And if the claim keeps referring to the CUP, does the reader know that the CUP means Central Utility Plant? No. So don't write CUP, write Central Utility Plant. And if you think you can cheat a little bit by putting a definition at the beginning of your claim to say that CUP means Central Utility Plant, that's not really helping the reader either, because you're making him go back to where the list of definitions are all the time. And it's actually been scientifically proven that acronyms and abbreviations don't work, because subconsciously, if you are reading a narrative and you read something like a day consequently occurred in the CUP, subconsciously you've got to stop, think what CUP means. Oh yes, that's Central Utility Plan, and then continue to reading. So my recommendation is do not use acronyms or abbreviations. And hey, how long extra does it take to type Central Utility Plant over CUP? Avoid legalese and unnecessarily complicated language. Many years ago, when I used to work for J.R. Knowles, I had a particular client that I used to look after, and he asked for something to be done, and I wasn't able to do it, so I passed it on to one of my colleagues, actually my direct boss, and he produced this particular piece of work. I sent it in to the client, and the next time I called on the client, he said, "Yeah, okay, I got that report that you did, but you didn't do it, did you?" And I said, "No, my colleague did it." He says, "It's full of Latin." Okay, right. He said, "Do you know what inter alia means?" I said, "Well, yeah, it means amongst other things." He says, "I know what inter alia means, but the engineer's from Poland. So do you think he's going to know what all these Latin tags mean?" And it was a very good thing to learn very early on in my career in contractual and claims matters, is that, you know, these people that big themselves up by using complicated language, complicated words and complicated sentences within claims or reports are not really doing themselves any favour if the engineer from Poland doesn't understand what they're talking about. So keep it simple. You know, the old acronym, the old whatever they call it, keep it simple, stupid. KISS, the KISS principle. Lastly, it's very easy to get confused. And if you look at any contract, it will say the engineer, the contractor, the employer. And when it's explaining a clause or the narrative of a clause, it will be the engineer this, the contractor this, the employer that. Doesn't use words like he, it, them. It's always using the name of the party. And that is to avoid any ambiguity or understanding. So it's a good habit to get into when you were preparing contractual correspondence and particularly claims. Use either the names of the parties or their contractual definitions. So Johnson Construction Group or the contractor. Thanks, Suzanne. We have to, my colleague Paul Gibbons, who sometimes presents training courses with me, he came up with a great phrase, and our claim has to, or the story of our claim, the narrative, has to lead the reader by the hand through the claim and lead to a logical conclusion. If you think about cause-effect entitlement, that's exactly what we're doing. First of all, in a claim, we need to introduce the project. Secondly, we need to talk about what happened on the project, the cause. Thirdly, we need to talk about what effect the event had on the project, and possibly then talk about cost calculations and delay analyses. Then we've got to demonstrate to the reader that the contractor has entitlement to make that claim under the contract. And the conclusion is, therefore, we are entitled to an extension of time of 30 days until this date and the payment of prolongation costs in the sum of this amount. So the claim needs to tell that story, just like a story in a novel. Very, very dangerous again, and many of our students, when they're producing work, they will do a great job of explaining the facts. This happened, the engineer sent a letter, the contractor sent a response, the engineer issued an instruction, the contractor placed his order, But when we think about how project records are often compiled, they're often written to somebody who understands what's going on. If we use these in isolation in our claim, and we don't explain to the reader of the claim what this means in terms of the claim, we are not actually doing ourselves any favors. We're just giving them a lot of facts and saying, okay, you decide what happened. That's not what we should be doing in our claim. We should be leading that person, the reader, by the hand through the claim, and we should be explaining. The engineer issued an instruction and included several revised drawings on this date, full stop. That's one way of doing it. The next way, and the proper way, this meant that we were involved in an awful lot of extra work in this area, that area, the other, that we would have to procure additional materials, etc., etc. You see the difference? One, we're telling the bare facts, and secondly, we are explaining what effect that had on the project. So we need to explain to the reader the conclusion that we wish them to reach and never let them draw their own conclusions. Thanks, Suzanne. We got to use our story. The narrative of the claim is our voice, so we need to explain other documents such as the cost calculations, the quantity takeoff if it's a variation, the prolongation cost calculations, the delay analysis programs. So very often, again, I'm sure that many of you that have reviewed claims will look at the documents that presented, and it's like the person who's prepared the narrative has never spoken to the person who's prepared the costs or the person who's prepared the delay analysis, because there's no explanation of what's been done. It just says the costs are included in Appendix A and the costs are $100,000. But there's no explanation how the costs have been calculated, why they've been calculated. There's lots and lots of spreadsheets, but we don't understand them. So these have got to all work in harmony. Thanks, Suzanne. Again, when we've got documents accompanying the claim, delay analyses, calculations, we need to explain in the narrative how these have been carried out step by step, so that that reviewer, who is not an expert quantity surveyor, who is not an expert planner or delay analysis, can understand the calculations, the delay analysis or whatever. Thank you. And again, going back to the fourth element of C, substantiation, every statement that we make in the narrative, we need to substantiate, and we need to include copies of the records to prove that that statement made was factual. So we need to include the copies of the evidence within our claim document. Very, very powerful is to, and I've said here on the slide, use the actual wording of clauses rather than paraphrasing their meaning. This also goes for using the wording from the records, from letters and the rest of it. So rather than saying the engineer issued a letter instructing us to carry out additional work, we can actually quote the engineer's words from the letter within the claim, and we need to make sure that, and this could be on the next slide, Suzanne, let's just check it, that we identify quotations correctly and consistently so that the reader knows it's a quotation. It's not something that you've made up. If we paraphrase something, there's always a suspicion that we might have put a spin on it. If we show this as a quote, and I like to use quote marks and italics, and we explain at the beginning of the claim that quotes are identified like this, most readers will take that as being fact, and it actually should be fact. Even there are misspellings or bad grammar in the document that you're quoting from, you need to put it in, warts and all. Last thing is, once you've done your claim, you've told your story, you've collected all the evidence, you're about to press print and put everything in the files. Well, don't. It's essential that a review is carried out before you press play. We do this as a matter of course. It's just company policy. Anybody at any level within the consultancy, before they send anything out to a client, it needs to be peer reviewed and reviewed by somebody who's got no knowledge of what's going on of this particular project or this particular claim. That is to do two things. Firstly, if you proofread your own work, you will read what you think you've written rather than what you've actually written. So that will pick up typos, bad grammar, etc. And secondly, and more importantly, if your colleague doesn't understand what you're saying in the claim, it's pretty likely that the person who's responsible for responding to the claim won't understand it either. So this is your cue to go back and do some improvements and make some edits. Thanks, Suzanne. If you are on the other side of the fence and you are responding to claims, because every claim needs a response, well, really everything that I've talked about so far, C's, the 4 key points, applies to a response document. So let's just have a quick revision. It needs to be user-friendly. It needs to be a standalone document. It needs to lead to a logical conclusion. So you applied for 100 days extension of time. I think that, or my findings lead me to believe that you're entitled to 80 days because. And the because is the important thing. It needs to be presented professionally. And we need to cover, as an engineer responding to the claim, even if the claim doesn't include cause, effect, entitlement and substantiation, we need to bear this in mind, and in our response, if we are actually giving a response, we need to cover these ourselves. The alternative to that, if the claim is so badly presented, is to either reject the claim because it hasn't proven entitlement, or hasn't proven that the amount of money we're claiming for, how it's been calculated, or not reject it but ask for further particulars. And we need to, if we're going to give that response, sort of response as an engineer, we need to explain what further particulars you need to give. Explain how the calculations have been carried out, for example. So that brings us on to question time, which I hope that someone will be passing the questions on to me, and I'll do my best to answer them.
Let me have a look.
This is when I get worried, Suzanne. Either people have not understood anything that I've said, or they've understood everything that I've said, so they don't have any questions. I'm not quite sure which it will be.
I'm sure it's the second.
It is. That was very clear indeed, Andy, very clear indeed, and very articulate. So do we have any questions either in the chat room, please? If you don't want to come on and speak, or direct. So I've got one here from Carl. if you have a very limited contract, i.e. small builder, on a very simple subcontract order, how can you determine fairly what entitlement to the claim there would be? So I'll repeat that. So if you have a very limited contract, i.e. small builder, on a very simple subcontract order, how can you determine fairly what entitlement to a claim there would be?
Yeah, a good point. The first thing we've got to look at the actual contract, because that's what the two parties have agreed to do. If there is no specific entitlement to make a claim for additional money or additional time, we've then got to look at the law. And that's where it starts to get a little bit complicated. But you know, we've got to also look at things in terms of common sense. If somebody gives you an order to build a 3-story building, and then gives you revised drawings and instructs you to build a 4-story building, common sense says that it will take additional time, and common sense says that the contractor will be paid more money, because effectively is building approximately another 25, it's a long time since, anyway, a lot more extra work. So, yeah, I mean, working internationally a lot, some of the contracts that we come across are very, very basic. You know, they've not been prepared with any real intention or knowledge or experience. So we have to work with what we're given. I hope that helps. Sometimes a claim, let's not call it a claim, let's call it a request for some additional time, or a request for some additional money. And it's not contractual, but it is moral. I don't want to go too far down that route, because it'll get more complicated and it gets more into legal issues. So I hope that helps anyway.
Okay. We've got another one. Andy, do you ever sit as a tribunal? I think it's probably on a tribunal. Is that right, Keith? You want to ask the question, Keith?
Yes, Andy, I just wondered if you were ever on the, rather than putting claims together, do you ever sit as an arbitrator or adjudicator, or sit in a dispute board?
I actually, many years ago, when the FIDIC contracts introduced DABs, I did all the training, and I qualified as an adjudicator, thinking that I could actually bring a lot of value as a member of a DAB, because, you know, I am of the old school. I think that we should concentrate on building things to the right time, the right quality, and the right budget. And I thought that could be something, A, I'd find enjoyable, and B, I could actually make a good contribution to. But in the Middle East, the employers and the engineers don't like adjudication. They don't like dispute adjudication boards, because, and my theory is that it erodes their ability to bully the contractors and treat them unfairly. So there just aren't any. It is very little adjudication, and most of the contracts have the requirements for dispute adjudication boards just struck out from the very beginning.
The reason I ask is because I sit as an arbitration adjudicator, but like you, I'm qualified as a dispute board member. And so much of what you've actually said rings so true with me. I'd like to give a set of your notes to a fair number of people, lawyers and QSs who represent parties. And in terms of the Latin, I think the bane of my life is a QS with a law degree, because they know more Latin than the lawyers do. And to prove they've studied the law and got a law degree, they use the Latin, and sometimes they use the wrong Latin.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Keith. And, you know, when I've seen things that have been prepared by people with all sorts of qualifications and the rest of it, and I look at it and I think, and, you know, my colleagues who do work as expert witnesses and work as adjudicators, why has somebody produced this? Why has somebody with so many qualifications produced something like this, which is so hard for an adjudicator and arbitrator to understand? Is it doing the job? And my answer is no.
Okay, we've got one more question then. Unfortunately, Andy and everyone, I'm going to have to leave, but Keith's going to wrap up. So the last question then, obviously without people raising, and Keith, you chairing that, please. Is there a delineation between a claim and a variation?
Well, definitely. A variation is something that is agreed to be some sort of change to the original scope of work or the contract. So, I mean, theoretically, the architect, engineer, contracts administrator should say, we want to change something, and here are the instructions for the change. This is a variation, and you'll get paid, and if there's any additional time implication, you'll get an extension of time for it. That tends not to happen, and engineers tend to give you instructions that comprise variations but don't acknowledge that it's a variation. And these instructions can come in many different forms: comments on shop drawings, comments on your material submissions, letters, instructions at meetings, etc. So they want you to do something different, but they will never put the hand up and say, hey, Mr. Contractor, this is a variation because we need it, we want the story built on the building. So then that variation, in order for you to get paid your time and money, if the engineer doesn't acknowledge that it's a variation, then it's incumbent on you as a contractor to make a claim for that instruction to turn it into a variation or something that you will get paid for and you're entitled to additional time for. So yes, there is a difference, but sometimes because of the administration of the architect, the engineer, or whoever, the contractor is obliged to make a claim to get payment in time.
Okay, thank you for that. Hopefully, David, that answers the question. I just need to depart now, but Andy, thanks very much indeed on behalf of myself and QSI, and I know Suzanne will be in touch. Keith, if I could hand over to you to pick up any other questions and close out, that would be genuinely appreciated, and we'll all look forward to reading more articles in the magazine, Andy. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Paul. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Paul. Are there any more questions? I think, Andy, to round up, I could repeat your talk, but I'm not going to because there's so many interesting points. I think some of the things sorry, my name is Keith Bliss. I'm the chairman of the UK and Ireland branch of QSI. But I think I sit as a tribunal, obviously. I sit as an arbitrator, and I spend a fair chunk of my time sitting as adjudicator. I think the points that resonated with me were really looking at them. Assume the reviewer has no prior knowledge of the project, because once you go to a tribunal, by virtue of the fact that they are the tribunal, they can have had no knowledge of the project, and people do assume that you do have some knowledge. And particularly with the construction adjudication, where you don't have to have lawyers or even experienced claims consultants, sometimes people do it themselves. And I have had sort of 3 lever arch files turn up and be told that Appendix E is the relevant correspondence. Appendix E was its own lever arch file, not paginated, nothing in there. It's just it's all in there somewhere. You sort it out. Irrelevant information should not be included in the narrative or document. Yes, I mean, how much time do I spend sorting out the wheat from the chaff? The fact that it rained on Tuesday is actually irrelevant to the fact that it was a variation and you had to put new windows in. You know, it's things like that, really. I also like to ensure the references to the parties with the narrative are unambiguous. Well, I can tell you, in the early days of adjudication in the UK, the RICS had a complaint, and they sent me, they didn't have a proper sort of system for reviewing complaints and things at the time. And so the head of dispute resolution service sent me an adjudicator's decision and said, This is the complaint. Would I mind having a quick look at it? And what the adjudicator had done is he had the two parties, and he did exactly as you suggested. He put in brackets after the first time he used it, an acronym. The trouble was both companies had the same letters but in a different order. And in the end, the claimant was ordered to pay the respondent an awful lot of money, which the claimant had been claiming. And all that happened is, as you went through the decision, you could almost say he wrote it in order. And then on this particular day, he started again, and he just flipped the two acronyms. To avoid that, I always refer to the parties as the claimant and the respondent, because I just find it easier rather than put the full name. It's quicker to type claimant respondent. Also, you remember, you're unlikely to say that the claimant has to pay the respondent, because you know it's the claimant who's making the claim. And also ensure a peer review is carried out before sending. I'm not a solicitor, but I'm a head of the construction team at a firm of solicitors. And we had somebody come in for work experience, signed all the paper at confidentiality. And this poor lad turned up one Monday morning, and I had to get a decision published that day. So what I did was I said to him, right, I haven't got time to go through anything with you at the moment, but here is my decision. It's a draft. Can you read it? And at the end of it, you should be able to tell me who the parties were, what the contract was about, what happened, why they fell out, and what I've decided. And left him to it. And he came back at the end, and actually I said to him, and at the end, I will ask you those questions. So if there's anything you don't understand, or if there's anything that you think is a typographical error, then please let me know. Because if you don't understand it, if it goes to enforcement, the judge might not either. And so that's what I always do. Andy, it's been a really interesting talk. Thanks ever so much for it takes a bit of preparation to do these talks. I know, because I do quite a lot of them myself, obviously. But it's been really interesting. And can we have your slides? I don't want it as a PowerPoint, because that's not fair, because anyone can use it then. But are you happy for people to have your slides as a PDF?
Well, definitely, and I will send them on to Suzanne when we finished here. And I just want to say, Keith, and to the people who are listening, is that Keith obviously knows his stuff. He sits as an adjudicator. So I thank you very, very much for reinforcing what I've said in my talk from an end user's perspective. I think, you've been there, you've done that, you've got the T-shirt, and it's great to have what I've talked about being validated by someone such as yourself. So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and I hope to be back again before too long.
No, well done, Andy. Thanks ever so much.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Keith.
Okay. Bye-bye then, Andy.
Bye.
Bye-bye.